"If you make me walk, I'll give you my fortune," shouted the bitter wheelchair-bound CEO, Ricardo, humiliating the new cleaner's son in front of the entire company. Cynical after the doctors gave up, he saw the challenge as a joke. But the boy, fearless, knelt down and rubbed a strong-smelling ointment on his lifeless legs. Ricardo mocked him, but to prove the farce, tried to move his muscles, and what his eyes saw next made him scream, leaving the whole room in shock. The air conditioning in the 80th floor boardroom of the glass tower in the heart of Manhattan seemed to chill the very bones. But Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, felt nothing. For 5 years, ever since the accident that had stolen his wife and the movement in his legs, the cold had been his permanent state. Confined to a wheelchair that obeyed the slightest command of his fingertips, he stared with contempt at the graphs projected on the wall. Numbers climbing, profits multiplying, a stock portfolio that ranked him among the most powerful men in the country. And for what? What good was all the money if he couldn't even feel the sand of the Hamptons beneath his feet? The bitterness was a slow poison he drank every day. His frustration was a dense, palpable cloud, and the shareholders, men in expensive suits and sycophantic smiles, felt it shrinking in their leather chairs. That day, the tension was even higher. The meeting dragged on, and an unexpected presence irritated him profoundly. Clara, the new cleaning lady, a woman with a tired but dignified gaze, had been clearly instructed not to bring her son. Yet, there he was, a boy of about 10, sitting in a corner, quiet as an angel, with a drawing pad on his lap. An issue with daycare, she had apologized, her voice trembling. Richard had merely fixed her with a venomous glare. During a coffee break, while the directors whispered about deals and the company's cash flow, the boy, David, approached timidly. His large, serene eyes met Richard's without fear. "Mister, why don't you walk?" he asked, his childish voice echoing in the sudden silence that fell over the room. The question, pure and innocent, struck Richard like a stone. He felt exposed, his vulnerability laid bare before his subordinates. A wave of sharp, cold cruelty washed over him. He saw his audience and decided to use it. A crooked, disdainful smile formed on his lips. "Because I don't want to," he sneered, and the sound of his voice was the trigger for the director's restrained laughter. "But you know what?" he continued, raising his voice, turning his pain into a grotesque spectacle. "If you can make me walk, I'll give you my entire fortune. I dare you, kid." The humiliation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Clara, pale, rushed to grab her son, her face awash with shame, apologizing in a whisper. "No!" Richard boomed, stopping her with a gesture. He accepted the challenge. "Go on, cure me." To his mother's terror, David didn't back down. He looked into Richard's eyes, a seriousness unusual for his age settling on his face. "My grandma down in Appalachia gave me a remedy that warms the bones." The boy pulled a small, old, dented tin from his school backpack and opened it. A strong scent, a mix of herbs and damp earth, invaded the sterile environment of the room. Ignoring the laughter and scornful looks, David knelt and, with his small fingers, spread the thick, green poultice on Richard's pale, lifeless legs. "There, now try," the boy said with unwavering confidence. "Pathetic," Richard spat. He looked at each person in the room, a challenge in his eyes. To prove the farce, to seal his victory in this cruel battle. He closed his eyes and, with all the force of his will, concentrated on moving the muscles in his right leg. What happened next was like thunder on a clear day. An intense heat, a sensation he hadn't felt for 5 long years, began to surge up his legs, vivid and almost unbearable. A painful tingling made him gasp, a sound that cut through the shocked silence of the room. He opened his eyes, heart hammering against his ribs, and looked down, and then he saw it. The big toe on his right foot, which had been motionless for a third of his adult life, twitched. A spasm, a tremor, a miracle. A collective gasp echoed in the boardroom, but Richard didn't hear it. He, the man whose vast fortune couldn't buy the most basic sensation, tried again, and his entire leg spasmed violently. Tears, long dammed up, streamed hot down his stone-like face for the first time in 5 years. It wasn't a cure, not yet, but it was movement. The silence that followed the movement was more deafening than any scream. The shareholders, men accustomed to trading millions in assets and speculating on the future of major deals, were paralyzed, wide-eyed, as if they had witnessed an apparition. A director's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor, but no one seemed to notice. All attention was fixed on Richard, the man who, a minute ago, was the epitome of skepticism and bitter resignation. Now he was panting, his pale face streaked with tears, his eyes fixed on his own foot as if it were a foreign entity. He tried again, his mind a storm of desperate commands. This time, just a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible contraction. But it was there. It hadn't been a hallucination. In a hoarse voice he barely recognized as his own, Richard growled, "Out, all of you, now." It wasn't a request, it was an unquestionable order, issued with the authority of a man who had built an empire from nothing. The directors scrambled, grabbing their briefcases and phones, leaving the room as if fleeing a fire, casting confused and frightened glances at the surreal scene they left behind. The door closed, and the silence returned, this time charged with a different, intimate, and terrifying tension. The air seemed to vibrate. Only 3 remained: Richard, in his chair of power that was also his prison, Clara, standing protectively beside her son, and David, who watched the millionaire with a calmness that bordered on the supernatural. Richard raised his eyes to Clara, and for the first time she saw not contempt, but something far more frightening. A desperate hunger, a sliver of hope that made him dangerous. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a trembling whisper. "Oh, what witchcraft is in this jar?" Clara flinched, pulling David closer. "It's not witchcraft, sir. It's just a poultice from my grandmother. She makes it with herbs from the mountains. She says it helps with aches, that it wakes up the nerves." The simplicity of the explanation was an insult to the complexity of his condition, to the years of useless treatments, to the world-renowned specialists who had declared his case hopeless. His entire capital, his billion-dollar net worth, couldn't buy what this boy had given him in seconds with a homespun recipe. The futility of his wealth hit him with the force of a punch. He looked at his legs. The warmth was still there, a faint echo, a promise. He couldn't let them go. That poultice, that boy, they were his only chance. The thought of losing them, of returning to the cold void of his existence, was more terrifying than the paralysis itself. He made a decision, his CEO's mind calculating risks and guarantees. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice regaining its firmness. "Starting today, you work for me. Only for me." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off. "You and the boy will live in my house. You'll have everything you need, food, clothes, the best education for him. In return, I want this." He pointed to the tin jar in David's hand. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The offer was absurd, so generous it sounded like a trap. This man had publicly humiliated her minutes ago. Now he wanted to imprison her in a gilded cage, all for his grandmother's remedy. She saw the glint in his eyes, a mix of pleading and command. He was a man used to buying what he wanted, whether it was a new gold mine or a glimmer of hope. She looked at David's innocent face, then at the billionaire's tormented one. The choice felt impossible. A pact with a broken and powerful man. "Sir, I can't," she began, her voice failing. Richard interrupted her, the intensity in his gaze burning like fire. "That wasn't a request. Clara, Your things will be collected today. You're coming with me." The drive from the business tower to Richard's mansion was a silent, tense blur. Clara held David's hand so tightly, her knuckles were white. The boy stared out the armored window of the luxury car, watching the city pass without the excitement he would normally feel. Richard didn't say a word, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was a whirlwind. With every jolt of the vehicle, he tried to recreate the sensation, the heat, the tingling. Was it real, or had it been a phantom spasm, a hallucination born of desperation and public humiliation? He refused to believe it. For the first time in years, a tiny sprout of hope was pushing through the arid soil of his soul, and he would protect it with the same ferocity he protected his business and his vast estate. The mansion, nestled in one of Connecticut's most exclusive enclaves, appeared behind wrought iron gates that swung open silently. It was less a house and more a fortress of glass and concrete, a masterpiece of modern architecture that felt cold and impersonal. To Clara, it was overwhelming. The luxury was aggressive, from the impeccably landscaped grounds to the abstract sculptures dotting the lawn. She felt small, an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. All that wealth, all those possessions, seemed to scream that she didn't belong. Her entire life could fit in the entrance hall. A discreetly uniformed staff member led them through corridors that resembled art galleries, the sound of their footsteps echoing on the polished marble. They were shown to a guest suite that was larger than Clara's entire apartment. It had its own living room, a balcony with an ocean view, and a bathroom that looked like a private spa. David, despite the tension, couldn't help but let out a soft "wow" at the sight of the plush, enormous bed. But to Clara, this was a gilded cage. The floor-to-ceiling windows, meant to offer a liberating view, felt like glass bars. She was trapped, a hostage to the hope of a powerful and unpredictable man. What would happen if the poultice didn't work again? That flicker of movement could have been a fluke, a cruel coincidence. Fear chilled her stomach. This man, a multi-millionaire accustomed to having the world at his feet, would not accept failure. Hours passed in restless silence. Food was brought on silver trays, but Clara could barely touch it. Finally, as evening fell, the staff member returned. "Mr. Sterling will see you in the library." With her heart pounding, Clara took David's hand and followed. Richard was there, having changed from his suit into linen trousers and a cotton shirt. The wheelchair was positioned near a massive window overlooking the glittering city lights. He seemed more relaxed, but his eyes burned with the same intensity. He dismissed the staff member with a wave and got straight to the point. "Again," he said, his voice low but charged with an urgency that allowed no refusal. He extended his motionless legs. "Apply the ointment, now." David looked to his mother for guidance. Clara felt panic rise in her throat. She knew what her grandmother always said about the herbs, about the respect owed to nature's timing. It wasn't an industrial product, mass-produced for immediate consumption. It was something sacred, ancient. Taking a deep breath, she summoned courage she didn't know she had, and met the gaze of the man who now controlled her life. "Sir, I'm sorry," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But it doesn't work like that." Richard raised an eyebrow, impatience turning his face into a mask of irritation. "What do you mean, it doesn't work like that? It's a poultice. You rub it on my skin. What's so complicated?" Clara swallowed hard, knowing her next words could seal her fate. "My grandmother always said, you can only use it once a day, and it has to be at the right time, when the sun sets. Using it again now, it won't do any good. It might even do harm." Clara's declaration hung in the library air, as defiant as the tolling of a bell at a funeral. Richard's expression hardened, the fragile hope quickly being replaced by his usual armor of skepticism and irritation. "What nonsense," he scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Now, your magic ointment comes with a mystic instruction manual. Once a day, at sunset. How convenient. What's next? A rain dance and the sacrifice of a chicken. The cruelty in his words was a sharp weapon, designed to wound and intimidate. But Clara held her ground. She didn't understand investments or profit margins, but she understood the traditions of her people, the knowledge passed down through generations. And that gave her a strength Richard's money couldn't buy. "I'm not making it up, sir. It's what my grandmother taught me," she insisted, her voice quiet but unshakable. "The plants have their own time. We have to respect it." Richard let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing among the shelves of books he no longer read. "Respect? I've spent the last 5 years being examined by doctors who respect science. Clara, I've undergone cutting-edge treatments that cost more than your entire family's assets for 10 generations, and not one of them mentioned the time of the plants." He gestured to his own legs with a mixture of fury and self-loathing. "They told me the nerves were dead. End of story. And today, for the first time, something happens, and you come to me with this faith healer mumbo-jumbo." The conflict was clear. On one side, the cold, implacable logic of a businessman who saw the world in terms of cause and effect, of actions and immediate results. On the other, the ancient empirical and patient wisdom of a woman whose only wealth was her cultural heritage. Richard, in his frustration, saw Clara's refusal as insubordination, perhaps even a ploy to buy time, to make herself seem important. He felt like a fool for having allowed a spark of hope to ignite. It was easier to believe the twitch in his foot had been a random spasm, a final goodbye from a dying nerve, than to accept that the solution to his suffering lay in a tin jar and the rules of an old woman from Appalachia. David, who had remained silent until then, took a step forward. "It's true, mister," he said, his childish voice surprisingly serious. "Grandma says the ointment is like planting a bean. You can't just pour water on it all the time, or the seed will drown. You have to wait." The simple, childlike analogy hit Richard in a way Clara's arguments couldn't. He looked at the boy's sincere face, devoid of any malice or self-interest. There was no way this child could be lying. There was only the pure, simple repetition of a truth he had been taught. That innocence disarmed some of his fury, leaving him with a residue of confusion and impatience. He sighed, a heavy sound of defeat and exhaustion. "Fine," he conceded, the word coming out with difficulty. "We'll do it your way, at sunset. But if tomorrow, at that exact moment, nothing happens..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The implied threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. He turned his back on them, maneuvering the wheelchair toward his massive mahogany desk, a clear gesture of dismissal. The night that followed was the longest of Clara's life. She and David had dinner in their lavish suite, the delicious food tasting like ash in her mouth. She tried to read to her son, but the words blurred before her eyes. Fear was a tight knot in her chest. What if it didn't work? What if her grandmother was wrong? What if today's movement had been a unique, unrepeatable miracle? Her life and her son's depended on the efficacy of a homemade poultice and the patience of a bitter billionaire. She sat on the balcony, looking out at the city below, a tapestry of lights indifferent to her drama, and prayed as she had never prayed before. The dawn at the mansion was met with a sepulchral silence. Richard had barely slept, his mind oscillating violently between hope and despair. Upon waking, the first thing he did, as he had every morning for the past 5 years, was to try to move his legs. Nothing. The familiar emptiness, the total lack of response between brain and muscle, hit him with a renewed, almost mocking force. The memory of the previous day's spasm seemed like a distant dream, a cruel hallucination. The bitterness returned in full force, poisoning his thoughts. Perhaps Clara and the boy were just talented charlatans, masters of some form of hypnotic suggestion that had made him imagine things. He felt like an idiot, a foolish billionaire duped by a folk remedy story. The tension was a thick fog that seeped into every corner of the house. The staff tiptoed around, sensing the storm brewing in their employer. Clara and David remained in their suite, the closed door feeling like a fragile barrier against Richard's impending wrath. The day dragged on, each tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall sounding like a hammer blow to their nerves. Around noon, an unexpected visit further complicated the scene. Dr. Evans, his personal physician and longtime friend, arrived for his routine weekly checkup. He was a kind, patient man who had been with Richard since the accident and had, with regret, overseen the failure of every expensive treatment, the trips to specialists in Europe and the US that had consumed a fortune with no results. Dr. Evans noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. "Richard, you seem different," he said, observing his friend with trained eyes. "More tense than usual. Trouble with the business. Sterling stocks take a dip." Richard looked away. "It's nothing, Al. Just business, as usual." But the lie was weak. The doctor saw Clara and David pass quietly down the hall and raised an eyebrow. "Visitors? That's new." Richard made up some excuse about the new cleaner having a personal issue, but the doctor didn't seem convinced. He knew Richard's aversion to any kind of disorder in his controlled routine. "Whatever it is, Richard, be careful," the doctor advised gently. "False hope can be more devastating than resignation." The doctor's words echoed Richard's own fears, fueling his skepticism. He spent the afternoon in his office, trying to distract himself with cash flow reports and the performance of his investment funds, but the numbers danced meaninglessly before his eyes. His mind was on the sun, watching its slow decline in the sky. Meanwhile, Clara prepared. She didn't just wait. She took David into the vast garden and, with a ritualistic seriousness, taught him to find the small leaves of a specific plant she recognized among the ornamental flowers. She crushed them with a smooth stone, mixing the fresh, green sap into a bit of the poultice from the jar, whispering words that David repeated, words his grandmother had taught them. To Richard, watching from his window, it looked like a theater of the absurd. Finally, the hour arrived. The sky over Connecticut was painted in hues of orange, pink, and violet. The air was still, heavy with expectation. Clara found him on the terrace where he often sat to watch the sunset, a masochistic habit that reminded him of all he had lost. Her heart was beating wildly. She carried the small tin jar as if it were the world's most precious treasure. "It's time, sir," she said, her voice a thread. He didn't answer, just watched her with cold, doubtful eyes. She knelt, just as she had the day before. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Threats, hopes, the weight of money and science, it all fell away. There were only the three of them, the dying son, and a question worth more than his entire estate. With trembling hands, Clara opened the jar, took the poultice, now infused with the fresh leaves, and reached toward Richard's pale skin. The tips of Clara's fingers were cold with nervousness, but as they touched Richard's skin, an electric current seemed to pass between them. The air grew heavy, each second stretching into an eternity. David watched, his eyes fixed on the scene, his breath held. With a gentleness that contrasted with the harshness of the moment, Clara began to massage the poultice into Richard's calves and thighs. The herbal scent was stronger today, mixed with the fresh aroma of the leaves they had gathered in the garden. She said nothing, focused on her task, her movements slow and rhythmic, as if performing a sacred ritual. Richard remained silent, his face an impenetrable mask. Inside, he was a battlefield. One part of him scoffed at the scene, at the primitivism of the act, while another part, a part he hated for its vulnerability, cried out in a silent plea. "There," she said finally, rising to her feet. "Now you have to believe." The word sounded alien in this environment of luxury and power. Believe. Richard almost laughed. He believed in spreadsheets, in profit and loss statements, in the price of gold and the volatility of cryptocurrency. Faith was an asset he did not possess. Still, something compelled him to try. Perhaps it was David's unwavering gaze or Clara's serene dignity. He closed his eyes, shutting out logic, shutting out the 5 years of failure. He didn't think about the dead nerves or the terminal diagnoses. He thought only of the heat he had felt the day before. He searched for it in his sensory memory, trying to will it into existence. Nothing. Just the familiar cold, the dead weight sensation of his limbs. The disappointment was a gut punch, so violent it made him choke. Skepticism returned with the force of a tidal wave, drowning the small island of hope. "I knew it," he hissed. Opening his eyes, fury twisting his features. This is a farce, a cruel joke. He turned on Clara, hatred burning in his eyes. "Get your things. I want you out of my house tonight. His threat was cut short by a sharp cry from David. "Look!" The boy pointed, his eyes wide. Richard, against his will, glanced down, and what he saw stole his breath. A vein in his left calf, a vein he hadn't seen pulse in years, was visibly twitching beneath the skin. It was an involuntary movement, a subtle muscle spasm, but it was undeniable. As he stared, mesmerized and terrified, the contraction happened again, stronger this time. And then the heat began. Not like the day before, a sudden wave, but like a slow ember, igniting deep within his muscles, spreading slowly, painfully. It was a pain unlike any he had ever known, not the pain of injury, but the pain of waking. The pain of something long dormant being forced back to life. He gasped, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The sensation intensified, climbing his thighs, a tingling that was both agony and ecstasy. He looked at Clara, his eyes wild with astonishment. She didn't look surprised, only relieved, silent tears streaming down her face. "It's warming up," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Grandma says when it warms up, that's the life coming back." The life coming back. The phrase struck him with monumental force. He, who measured life in terms of cash flow and acquisitions, was being confronted with a far more fundamental definition. The simple act of a muscle contracting, of a nerve firing a signal, was a miracle of a magnitude his entire financial empire could not equal. The pain became almost unbearable. He gritted his teeth, a groan escaping his lips. He wanted it to stop, and at the same time, he wanted it to never stop. In the midst of the agony, he focused, gathering every ounce of his formidable willpower, and sent a single, desperate command to his right foot. "Move!" And this time, it wasn't a spasm. Slowly, hesitantly, almost imperceptibly, the tip of his big toe lifted, defying gravity and 5 years of paralysis. It hung in the air for a second. A monument to the impossible before falling back. Richard let out a sob, a sound that was half laugh, half cry. He looked at Clara, no longer with the fury of a tyrant, but with the raw vulnerability of a man who had just witnessed a resurrection. The weeks that followed transformed Richard's mansion. The once rigid and silent routine, dictated by the whims of a bitter man and the soft whir of his chair's wheels on marble, gave way to a new rhythm, a new cadence of hope and pain. The sunset ritual became the focal point of the day, a sacred event awaited with a mixture of anxiety and expectation. Every afternoon, Clara would prepare the poultice with fresh leaves, and David would watch, learning the process with a seriousness that belied his age, and every evening Richard would submit to the process, enduring the agonizing wave of heat that woke up his legs. Pain was his constant companion. The long, silent nerves awoke screaming, sending his brain a cacophony of signals he hadn't felt in years. Burning, pins and needles, violent cramps that left him drenched in sweat and exhausted. There were moments he wanted to give up, when the familiar darkness of his condition seemed a preferable refuge to this daily torture. But then he would see Clara's steady gaze or hear David's encouraging voice. "You can do it, Mr. Richard," and he would find the strength to continue. He was waging a war within his own body, a battle for every millimeter of movement, for every rediscovered muscle fiber. In the process, something else began to awaken. Richard's armor of cynicism, forged in the fire of tragedy and tempered by frustration, began to crack. He found himself watching Clara differently, no longer as the insignificant cleaner or the guardian of a mystical secret, but as a woman of extraordinary strength. She would rebuke him without fear when his bitterness overflowed. "Your pain doesn't give you the right to be cruel, sir," she would say, her voice calm but with a spine of steel. "You have a second chance. Many people don't. Honor it." Her words would hit their mark, disarming him. No one had dared speak to him that way in years. His employees feared him. His partners flattered him. Clara, with her simplicity and unshakable dignity, was a mirror that forced him to confront the man he had become. He also found himself captivated by David's unwavering faith. The boy had no doubts. For him, Richard's recovery was not a matter of if, but when. He would spend hours in the library, not reading the books on asset management or stock market trends, but drawing in his sketchbook. One day, Richard, moved by curiosity, wheeled himself closer and saw that David was drawing a scene, a man standing and smiling next to a woman and a boy in front of a house. "That's us," David said simply. "When you can walk, we'll go for a walk in the garden." The innocence and certainty of that statement shook Richard. This boy, who had nothing, was offering him a future, an image of happiness that all his capital couldn't buy. One day, Dr. Evans came for his appointment and found Richard not in his wheelchair, but on a piece of physical therapy equipment that had been gathering dust in a corner of the mansion's gym. With Clara's help, he was trying to stand, his legs trembling violently, his face contorted with effort. The doctor was stunned. He conducted an examination, his eyes widening as he detected faint but undeniable neurological responses in areas he himself had declared clinically dead. "Richard, what is this? What have you been doing?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Richard just smiled, a genuine smile, for the first time in years. "I'm trying a new kind of investment, Tal, one with a return you wouldn't believe." He glanced at Clara, who was wiping the sweat from his brow with a towel. In that look, there was not just gratitude. There was something more, something he didn't yet dare to name, something that scared and thrilled him in equal measure. The turning point, the moment when possibility solidified into certainty, didn't happen with a bang, but with a nearly imperceptible sound. It was at the end of a particularly brutal afternoon. The pain had been relentless, and progress seemed to have stalled. Richard was exhausted, frustration gnawing at the edges of his newfound hope. He was sitting by the edge of the pool, the setting sun casting long shadows across the blue water, feeling defeated. Clara had applied the poultice, and he'd spent the last hour trying, unsuccessfully, to voluntarily contract his thigh muscles. Nothing. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken disappointment. David, sensing the tension, sat a short distance away, drawing in his sketchbook, the scratch of pencil on paper the only sound. Suddenly, the pencil rolled from David's hand, clattering on the flagstone and bouncing near Richard's wheelchair, stopping inches from his foot. "Oh, no," the boy lamented, reaching for it, but the object was just out of his grasp. Before Clara could move to help, a primal instinct, a reflex buried under 5 years of inertia, fired in Richard's brain. He didn't think, he simply reacted. With a grunt of effort that seemed to tear from his throat, he leaned forward and, driven by a strength he didn't know he possessed, his right leg shot out. The foot kicked forward, a clumsy, spastic movement, but unmistakably intentional, and tapped the pencil. The small wooden cylinder rolled gently back to David's outstretched hand. The world seemed to stop. David looked at the pencil, then at Richard's foot, and a radiant smile lit up his face. Clara brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide, a sob of shock and joy escaping her lips. Richard sat frozen, his heart hammering, his entire body trembling. He stared at his own leg, extended out in front of him as if it belonged to someone else. It hadn't been a spasm, it had been an act, a deliberate act. He had seen an object, willed himself to reach for it, and his body, his treacherous, useless body, had obeyed. In that moment, the dam he had built around his emotions for 5 long years finally broke. The bitterness, the anger, the self-pity, the grief for his wife, it all came flooding out in an overwhelming wave. And for the first time, he didn't meet it with cynicism or coldness, he met it with tears. Deep guttural sobs shook his frame, the sound of a man's pain finally allowing itself to be felt. Clara rushed to his side, but not to comfort him. She knelt before him and, with a reverence that left him speechless, touched his knee. "You did it," she whispered, her own tears flowing freely. "You did it." The news of the miracle spread like wildfire. Dr. Evans, examining Richard the next day and witnessing the movement repeated, was speechless, mumbling about spontaneous neural regeneration unprecedented in medical literature. He wanted to run tests, publish papers, but Richard forbade him. "This isn't science, Al, at least not yours," he said, with a calm the doctor had never seen. The dynamic in the house changed fundamentally. It was no longer the millionaire and his hostages of hope. It was 3 people bound by a common purpose, an unlikely team fighting the same battle. From that day on, the physical therapy intensified, no longer as a futile attempt, but with a clear, tangible goal. Richard was no longer just trying to feel. He was relearning how to walk, and for the first time, he knew in his heart that no matter how hard the road, he would get there. The challenge he had mockingly thrown down in that boardroom was, unbelievably, coming true. That kick of the pencil was the breaking of a dam. From that day on, the question was no longer if, but how. The mansion transformed into a private rehabilitation center, fueled by a fierce determination Richard had once reserved only for closing multi-million-dollar deals. Parallel bars were installed in the old game room, and a physical therapist, hired under a strict non-disclosure agreement, came daily. But the true pillar of his recovery was Clara. She was there for every step, every groan of pain, every drop of sweat. She had learned the correct exercises from the therapist, and her presence was a balm more potent than the poultice itself. Her steady hand on his back, her calm voice saying, "One more, you can do it," were the fuel that kept him from crumbling when his muscles screamed in agony. The intimacy between them grew, woven in the long silences of effort and the small daily victories. One evening, after a particularly grueling session left him trembling and pale, he was sitting on the terrace, watching the city lights. Clara brought him a glass of water, and their fingers brushed briefly as he took it. The contact was electric. "She was strong, too," Richard said suddenly, his voice low, breaking a years-long silence on the subject. Clara didn't need to ask who he was talking about. "Helen, my wife. She would have liked you." The confession hung in the air, fragile and precious. It was the first time he had mentioned her without the shadow of bitterness. He looked at the horizon, at the empire he had built, at all the assets and wealth that seemed so empty now. "I built a fortune," he continued more to himself. "I built a castle of gold and dollars, but I was living in a dungeon. You two showed me that the greatest asset of all can't be listed on the stock exchange." His relationship with David also deepened. The boy was his daily dose of pure optimism. He didn't see the struggle or the pain. He only saw progress. David taught him patience, to celebrate the achievement of flexing an ankle with the same joy Richard would celebrate an unexpected profit on his investments. One afternoon, as Richard, leaning on the bars, attempted a shaky step, David was beside him, holding one of his hands. Like this, Mr. Richard, one foot then the other, just like learning to ride a bike. Richard laughed, a genuine, rusty sound. In that moment, he felt a protective love so overwhelming it made him dizzy. He didn't just owe this boy a fortune, he owed him his life, and he would ensure David's future was brighter than any treasure he could amass. The trust fund he'd promised would be just the beginning. He would give this boy opportunities that money alone couldn't buy. The outside world, however, couldn't be kept at bay forever. Richard had isolated himself, cancelling meetings and managing his empire via video calls, always carefully framed from the waist up. But the whispers had begun. His seclusion was uncharacteristic. On a Saturday afternoon, as Richard, with Clara's help, managed to stand on his own for 10 glorious seconds, the doorbell rang. Ignoring it, they celebrated the milestone with an awkward, exultant hug. But the chime was followed by an authoritative voice in the hall. A maid appeared at the doorway, her face pale. "Mr. Sterling, Miss Beatrice is here. She insisted on coming in." The name dropped like a block of ice into the warm atmosphere. Beatrice, his late wife's younger sister, a sharp, elegant woman who had never hidden her disdain for him. Before Richard could say anything, she appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed, her face a mask of sophistication. Her eyes took in the scene. Richard, standing, sweaty and disheveled, leaning on Clara, a woman she clearly dismissed as a servant, with an unknown boy at their side. The shock on her face quickly curdled into a frosty expression of contempt and suspicion. "Richard," she said, her voice as sharp as broken glass, "what in God's name is going on here?" Beatrice's presence in the room was like a polar wind, instantly freezing the atmosphere of triumph and warmth. Her eyes, the same pale blue as Helen's but devoid of her kindness, swept the scene with swift, merciless judgment. She saw Richard, the man she had always considered an ambitious brute who didn't deserve her sister, on his feet, but in a vulnerable way she had never witnessed. And he was leaning on Clara, whose simple cotton clothes immediately marked her as someone of a lower class. Beatrice's expression twisted into a mixture of astonishment and revulsion. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice a whip. "I heard the rumors that you'd lost your mind, locking yourself away in here, but this is a circus." Richard, caught off guard and off balance both physically and emotionally, faltered. His legs, already at their limit, trembled and gave way. Clara caught him with a strength that belied her size, preventing his fall. The effort made her grunt, and the sight of this physical intimacy seemed to disgust Beatrice even more. "Get your hands off him," she ordered Clara, as if speaking to a dog. "Who do you think you are, putting your hands on my brother-in-law?" Before Richard could intervene, Clara helped him into the nearby wheelchair and straightened up, facing Beatrice with a calm that contrasted with the other woman's fury. "I'm Clara, and I'm helping Mr. Sterling." The simplicity of the answer only inflamed Beatrice. Helping or taking advantage? It must be very easy to manipulate a man in his condition. "Tell me, how much is he paying you for your services?" The venomous insinuation hung in the air. David, sensing the hostility, ran to his mother's side and grabbed her hand, glaring at Beatrice with frightened eyes. Richard felt a surge of protective fury he hadn't felt in years. "That's enough, Beatrice," he growled, his voice hoarse. "You have no right to come into my house and insult my guests." "Guests?" she laughed, a humorless sound. "Richard, please, open your eyes. Your grief has made you blind. This woman and her son, they're grifters. Do you think I don't know how their kind operates? They see a man with a large estate, lonely, and they worm their way in. They're after your fortune, the inheritance that should belong to Helen's memory." Every word was a dagger, designed to exploit his insecurities and his grief. The conflict unfolding was not just about Clara, it was about Helen's legacy, about Richard's loneliness, and about the social chasm that separated their worlds. Beatrice represented the past, the cynical high society that viewed everything through the lens of money and status. She couldn't conceive that the connection between Richard and Clara could be genuine. To her, it was just another deal, a sordid transaction where the cleaner was trying to secure a good return on her investment. "I demand you send them away, Richard. Now, for my sister's memory. You owe her that." Richard looked from Beatrice to Clara. He saw Clara's pale but resolute face. He saw David's small hand clutching hers tightly. They hadn't abandoned him in his worst moments, when he was just a broken, bitter man. They had rebuilt him piece by piece, with an herbal poultice and unwavering faith. In contrast, Beatrice, with her designer clothes and inherited wealth, had never offered him anything but contempt. The choice was clear yet agonizing. To reject Beatrice was, in a way, to sever one of the last ties to Helen. He took a deep breath, gathering his strength. "You're wrong, Beatrice," he said, his voice firm. "Clara and David aren't here for my money. They gave me something all my capital couldn't buy." Beatrice let out a sigh of exasperation. "Oh, please, don't give me this cheap melodrama. What could they possibly give you? A magic potion, a miracle cure?" The irony of the question hit Richard with full force. He looked down at his own legs, then back at Beatrice, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Yes," he said, the word landing like an anvil in the silent room. "That's exactly what they gave me." Richard's statement, delivered with a dead seriousness, hung in the air, dense and incomprehensible to Beatrice. She stared at him, her expression of disdain faltering for an instant, replaced by genuine confusion. "What are you talking about, Richard? Have you lost your mind?" she asked, her voice slightly less sharp, now tinged with a condescending concern. She turned on Clara as if she were the source of an infection. "What have you been feeding him? What kind of lies have you been telling?" Before Clara could answer, Richard cut in, his voice gaining strength. "It wasn't a lie, it was a dare. And they won." He began to tell the story, not all of it, but enough. He described the scene in the boardroom, the arrogant challenge he'd issued, the poultice in the tin jar, the first twitch of his toe. He relayed the tale concisely, like a CEO presenting a report, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more shocking and bizarre. Beatrice listened, her face moving from disbelief to horror, and finally to a grim conviction that grief had finally broken Richard's mind. To her, a woman whose life was governed by the logic of the stock market and the unspoken rules of the elite, the story sounded like the ravings of a madman. Herbs from Appalachia curing a spinal injury that the world's best neurosurgeons had deemed irreversible. It was easier to believe in Bitcoin mined on the moon. "So that's it," she said, her voice low and trembling, not with emotion, but with a cold, calculating anger. "They've convinced you of this fantasy. It's the perfect con. They don't just take your money. They make you believe you owe them everything." She took a step toward Clara, her gaze withering. "You are despicable, using a disabled man's hope to rob him." The insult struck Clara, but it was David who reacted. "Don't talk to my mum like that," he yelled, his childish voice full of protective fury. "Grandma's ointment works. Mr. Richard is walking." The boy's testimony, in its purity, should have been moving, but to Beatrice it was merely confirmation that the child had been coached to play his part in the farce. She ignored David and focused on Richard. Changing tactics, the anger gave way to a feigned concern. "Richard, listen to me. You are vulnerable. What do you think Helen would think of this? Of you being taken in by these people?" The use of Helen's name was a weapon, and Beatrice wielded it without hesitation. Richard's internal conflict was palpable. Beatrice, for all her cruelty, was family, a link to the love of his life. Clara and David were newcomers, an anomaly in his existence. Doubt, a venomous snake, slithered into his mind. What if Beatrice was right? What if he was so desperate that he had seized on a coincidence, a random muscle spasm, and built a castle of hope on quicksand? What if Clara, even subconsciously, was just taking advantage of his need? Seeing the hesitation on his face, Beatrice pressed her advantage. "I'm going to handle this, Richard. I'll call Dr. Evans. I'll hire the best psychiatrists. And I will make sure these two are out of your life for good, with a restraining order if I have to. I will stay here to take care of you, to protect your estate and your sanity." The threat was clear. She was declaring war, positioning herself as the guardian of his legacy against the intruders who, in her view, threatened it all. Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. She looked at Richard, his face a mask of conflict and pain. She saw the doubt in his eyes. After everything they had been through, after every painful step, every small victory, he was faltering. The power and conviction of Richard's world, represented by Beatrice, was an overwhelming force. How could her word, the word of a simple cleaner, compete with that? Fear paralyzed her. She could lose everything, the security she had found, her son's future, and most importantly, the hope she had helped reignite. She waited for Richard to defend her, to tell Beatrice she was wrong, but he remained silent, lost in his own internal battle, leaving her exposed and helpless before the storm. Richard's silence was more devastating to Clara than any accusation. In that silence, she heard the validation of everything Beatrice had said, that she was a nobody, a grifter, a fraud. She saw the hesitation in the eyes of the man she had helped raise up, and her heart broke. He, with all his power, with all his newfound strength, was choosing not to fight for her. Dignity, which was her strongest armor, wrapped around her. She would not beg. She would not try to defend herself against the wall of prejudice and wealth that Beatrice represented. With a calm motion, she took David's hand. "Let's go, my son," she said, her voice quiet but crystal clear, cutting through the tension in the room. "We don't belong here." Her decision, so swift and final, seemed to shock both Richard and Beatrice. Before either could react, Clara turned and walked toward the door, pulling David with her. She did not look back. Each step was an assertion of her own worth, of her refusal to be defined by Beatrice's cruel terms. The sight of their retreating backs was the trigger that finally snapped Richard out of his paralysis. The fear that hit him was primal and overwhelming, stronger than the fear of never walking again. It was the fear of going back to the man he was before them, alone, bitter, trapped in a golden dungeon. The thought of their absence, of the silence that would descend, of the sunset ritual vanishing forever, was unbearable. "No!" he yelled, his voice tearing through the air. The word was a command, a plea, a roar of desperation. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair, and with a burst of adrenaline and strength born of panic, he did the unthinkable. He pushed himself up. It wasn't graceful. It was a raw, clumsy effort. His arms shook, the muscles in his legs screamed in protest, sending lancing shards of pain up his spine, but he was standing alone. Without Clara's support, without the parallel bars, without anything but his own terrified will. He stood there, swaying dangerously, his entire body a symphony of pain and effort. Beatrice gasped, taking a step back, her eyes wide with shock. What she was witnessing defied all logic. Clara stopped at the door, turning slowly. Her face was streaked with tears as she saw what he was doing, the sacrifice he was making to prove a point that words could no longer make. "Clara, don't go," Richard panted, each word a struggle. He took a step. It was a shuffle, a controlled stumble, but it was a step. Then another. He was moving toward her, each inch a victory won at an immense cost. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the tears that now flowed freely. "You see, Beatrice," he said, his voice strained, never taking his eyes off Clara. "This is the miracle. This is the magic. It's not in a jar of ointment. It's in her faith, in her strength. He took another step, nearly falling, but righted himself with a grunt. He was only a few feet from Clara now. She didn't rob me. She gave me my life back. And that is a debt no fortune can repay. He stopped directly in front of Clara and David, his chest heaving, his legs trembling so violently it was a miracle he was still upright. He looked into Clara's eyes, and in them she no longer saw doubt, only absolute certainty and a vulnerability that disarmed her completely. Behind them, Beatrice was silent, the arrogance drained from her face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated astonishment. The reality of what she was seeing was undeniable. It wasn't a con. It wasn't a trick. It was real. The brother-in-law she despised, the man she considered permanently broken, was standing before her, moved by a force she could not comprehend. She had lost her logic, her money, her social standing. None of it mattered in the face of the raw, undeniable truth of that moment. The war she had declared was over before it had even begun, annihilated not by arguments, but by 3 impossible steps. The climax of that moment did not dissipate with Beatrice's stunned, silent departure. It remained vibrating in the air, a palpable energy that redefined the universe within that room. Richard, still standing through sheer force of will, felt every fiber of his body scream. His legs were 2 trembling columns of fire about to collapse. But he didn't sit. Not yet. He reached out a hand, not for support, but in a gesture of supplication, and touched Clara's face. Her skin was wet with tears, and his thumb wiped them away with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. I hesitated. For a moment, the poison of my old world, it almost won. Never again. In that instant, the entire power dynamic that had existed between them dissolved. He was not the millionaire CEO, and she was not the cleaner. They were simply a man and a woman, forged together in the crucible of pain and hope. Clara covered his hand with hers, feeling the tremor that ran through him. "There's nothing to forgive," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You proved everything, not with words, but with this." She glanced at his legs, at the upright stance that was the most powerful testimony of their journey. It was only then that the adrenaline began to recede, and Richard's body finally betrayed him. His legs buckled, and he would have fallen if Clara and David hadn't lunged forward, catching him, guiding him gently back to the safety of his chair. The collapse was as complete as his stance had been triumphant. He sat there, panting, spent, but with a smile on his lips. It was the smile of a free man. The months that followed were ones of accelerated transformation. Beatrice's departure was like the removal of a tumor. Without her cynical presence, the house bloomed. Richard's recovery, buoyed by his emotional victory, advanced in leaps and bounds. Soon he was on crutches, moving through the house with a difficulty that was to him the sweetest freedom. He relearned how to feel the world, the sensation of the carpet beneath his bare feet, the hot water of the shower on his calves, the garden breeze on his ankles. Every sensation was a gift, a miracle he would never again take for granted. He sold off stock, liquidated some minor assets, not out of financial need, but to simplify his life, to rid himself of the excess that had suffocated him for so long. His focus was no longer on accumulating wealth, but on building a life. His relationship with Clara blossomed into a deep, quiet love. They didn't need grand declarations. Their love was built in the everyday gestures, in the way she adjusted his crutch, in the way he watched her read to David, in the shared smiles over a cup of coffee. He fell in love with her resilience, her innate kindness, her simple wisdom that was more valuable than all the advice of his financial consultants. And he discovered his love for David was that of a father. He was there to help with homework, to hear about his dreams of being an artist, to teach him about the stars from the terrace. He began the legal process of setting up a trust fund for the boy, an estate of stocks and secure investments that would guarantee his future forever, fulfilling the promise he had once made so cruelly. Finally, the day came. It was a sunny morning, 6 months after Beatrice's visit. Richard, dressed in a simple but elegant suit, walked unaided, with only a mahogany cane for support, to the center of the garden where Clara and David waited. His steps were slow, deliberate but steady. Each one was an echo of that first, desperate struggle toward her. He stopped in front of Clara. The sun shone in her hair, and he thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. He handed her an envelope. Inside were the documents for David's trust fund, a fortune that would change the boy's life forever. "I've kept my promise," he said, his voice steady. "The dare was for my fortune, and there it is." Clara looked at the papers, the numbers so large they seemed unreal, but her eyes were filled with something other than avarice. It was deep, abiding love. "But," Richard continued, and his heart pounded with a strength he hadn't felt since his youth, "what I really want to give you can't be deposited in a bank." With an effort that cost him dearly, he knelt. The movement was clumsy, painful, but he did it. Placing one knee on the soft grass, he looked up at the shocked, tear-streaked face of the woman who had saved him. "The dare was for my fortune, but what I want to give you is my name. Clara, will you marry me?" Richard's words hung in the sunlit garden air, as powerful and unexpected as the first movement of his toe. Clara stared down at him, kneeling before her, a gesture that required Herculean effort, a testament of pain and devotion, and the world seemed to spin. The tears she had been holding back spilled over, not from sorrow or shock, but from a joy so overwhelming it stole her breath. David, beside her, looked from his mother to Richard, his large, serious eyes understanding the gravity of the moment in a way only children can. He smiled, a slow, radiant grin that sealed the instant. Clara needed no words. She nodded, an almost imperceptible movement, and then again, stronger, as a sob of happiness escaped her lips. She knelt too, on the grass in front of him, and hugged him, an embrace that held all the pain, the struggle, and the victory of the past months. The wedding was simple, private, held right there in the garden that had become the setting for his transformation. The only guests were David, Dr. Evans, whose admiration for Richard had deepened into a true friendship, and a handful of staff who had been silent witnesses to the daily miracle. There was no pageantry, no display of wealth. The celebration was not about a billionaire's estate, but about the union of a family forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Richard, leaning on his cane but standing tall and proud, watched Clara, in a simple white dress, walk toward him with David by her side. In that moment, he understood the true meaning of net worth. It wasn't the numbers in his bank accounts, but the fullness in his heart. In the years that followed, Richard's life changed in ways he could never have predicted. Sterling Industries continued to thrive, but his leadership shifted. He delegated the day-to-day operations, focusing instead on philanthropy. With Clara, he established the Awakening Foundation, an organization dedicated to researching and preserving the knowledge of medicinal plants from traditional communities, like Clara's grandmother's, and funding rehabilitation treatments for those without resources. He invested heavily in the Appalachian region, not for exploitation, but for sustainable development, building schools and health centers, ensuring the community that had given him his cure would prosper. His fortune, once an instrument of power and isolation, became a tool for healing and connection. The cold, impersonal mansion filled with life. David's laughter echoed through halls that once heard only the whir of a wheelchair. The scent of herbs from Clara's kitchen mingled with the aroma of flowers from the garden. Richard never regained the agility of a man who hadn't endured his trauma and pain at a low, manageable level. became a constant companion, a humble reminder of his journey. But he walked. He ran clumsily with David on the beach, feeling the sand beneath his feet. He danced slowly with Clara on the terrace under the stars. Every step was a prayer of gratitude. One afternoon, years later, Richard sat in his library, watching David, now a talented teenager, show Clara his latest drawings. The sketchbook was filled with vibrant portraits. His great-grandmother in the mountains, his mother smiling, and Richard standing tall, holding both their hands. Richard picked up the old dented tin jar, which he kept on his desk like his most precious possession. He opened it, and the strong, earthy smell transported him back to that boardroom. He thought of the man he had been that day, bitter, cruel, drowning in a joyless wealth, and he thought of the man he was now. Skepticism had been his armor, but love had been his cure. He realized the challenge he had thrown down in a moment of contempt hadn't been for David, but for himself. It was a dare to break his own chains, to allow himself to feel, to believe in the impossible. And in fulfilling his promise to give away his fortune, he had, in fact, received the greatest wealth of all, a family, a purpose, and a second chance to truly live.